Forget everything you have seen in films like Gladiator or the series Rome. The true reality of an ancient Roman army battle was something completely different from what Hollywood shows us. While cinema presents heroic and chaotic combats, Roman battles were meticulously organized machines of destruction where silence was more terrifying than screams and where discipline killed more than individual courage. During the centuries of Roman conquest, the Roman legions developed a combat system so effective that it transformed Rome from a small Italian town into the largest empire of the ancient world. Today, we are going to reveal exactly what it was like to participate in one of these battles. From the moment the Roman soldiers woke up until the brutal reality of the after-combat, prepare yourself to discover the truth behind the Roman wars. Unlike in films where armies simply appear ready to fight, the preparation for Roman battles began hours, sometimes days, before the first sword strike. The historian Polybius, who witnessed the functioning of the Roman legions in the 2nd century before Christ, described with impressive details how this preparation transformed ordinary men into instruments of war. The morning of a battle began well before dawn. The Roman soldiers were awakened by the sound of the cornu, a bronze trumpet that echoed through the camp. Unlike cinematic scenes of warriors sleeping in luxurious tents, the reality was much more brutal. Most legionaries slept on the ground, protected only by their wool cloak. In colder provinces like Gaul or Britain, many woke up with frozen toes, a problem so common that there is archaeological evidence of amputations due to frostbite among Roman soldiers. Breakfast was a quick and practical meal. Roman training required every legionary to carry his own rations: grains of wheat, onions, garlic, and occasionally salted meat. Before a battle, he prepared a thick porridge called pulse by mixing crushed grains with hot water. There was no time for elaborate meals. Caesar mentions in his commentaries on the Gallic War that these men frequently ate while marching, chewing hard wheat biscuits that could break teeth if they were not softened. First, the Roman armament was checked obsessively. Every legionary inspected his lorica segmentata, the famous iron plate armor, looking for cracks or loose joints. A single defect could mean death. The centurions, officers responsible for groups of 80 men, circulated through the ranks checking if the gladius, the short Roman swords, were sharp enough to penetrate flesh and bone. There are accounts of soldiers punished by whipping for presenting equipment in poor condition. The Roman preparation tactics included something that films never show: the strategic silence. Unlike the howling hordes that Hollywood loves to show, the Roman legions marched into combat in almost total silence. Only the commands of the centurions broke the calm. This silence was not accidental. It was calculated to intimidate the enemy and maintain discipline. Polybius describes how Celtic tribes were truly terrified, seeing thousands of soldiers advancing in perfect synchronization without a single war cry. The formation of marching columns began hours before contact with the enemy. Each legion counted approximately 5,000 men, organized into 10 cohorts. The first cohort, composed of the most experienced soldiers, marched at the head. The velites, light soldiers with spears and small shields, were sent forward as scouts. The Roman Empire developed a system of visual communication using colored standards that allowed coordination of movements even at great distance. Something that shocks by its practical brutality was the anticipated treatment of the wounded. Military doctors called medici prepared care stations behind the lines. They organized bronze surgical instruments, saws for amputations, cauterizers to stop bleeding, forceps to extract arrowheads. Archaeological discoveries on sites like Vindolanda show that these instruments were surprisingly sophisticated. The doctors also prepared large quantities of sour wine used as disinfectant and vinegar mixed with herbs to fight infections. Roman commanders used this time to study the terrain obsessively. Caesar describes how he spent hours before Alesia studying every hill, every stream, looking for tactical advantages. Roman military strategies did not depend on improvisation. They were the result of meticulous reconnaissance. Roman engineers prepared rudimentary maps using measuring sticks and observation instruments, mapping distances and elevations. A rarely mentioned detail was the crucial role of animals. Besides the obvious cavalry, the army of ancient Rome depended on mules to transport heavy equipment, particularly the ballistae and onagers, the siege weapons. Each legion had hundreds of pack animals, and specialized handlers guaranteed they were fed and ready. On difficult terrain like the Alps, the loss of a pack animal could mean abandoning vital equipment. When the battlefield came into view, began what the Romans called the instruction, the positioning for combat. It was perhaps the most critical moment, where Roman wars were often decided even before the first blow was struck. The superiority of Roman tactics did not reside in the individual ferocity of the soldiers, but in the deadly mathematics of their formation. The standard Roman formation was called triplex aces, 3 lines of combat. The first line, composed of the hastati, consisted of younger soldiers generally between 18 and 25 years old. Behind them were the principi, veterans in their maximum strength between 25 and 35 years old. The third line was formed by the triarii, the oldest and most experienced soldiers who only entered combat in desperate situations. There is a Latin expression that has survived through the centuries: ad triarios venemus. We have come to the triarion, meaning that the situation was critical. The spacing between soldiers was precisely calculated. Each legionary occupied approximately 1 square meter of space in tight formation. This may not seem like much, but it was sufficient to wield the gladius in the scutum, the large rectangular shield. Vegetius, the military writer of the 4th century, specifies that the space should allow 3 steps forward, 2 backward, and 1 on each side. During Roman training, the soldiers practiced these movements until they became automatic. The cohorts were organized in a checkerboard formation called quincunx. Instead of forming a continuous line, the units of the first line were separated by spaces that were covered by the units of the second line. This arrangement had multiple advantages. It allowed tired soldiers to retreat toward the second line to rest, created controlled penetration points where the enemy could be channeled and encircled, and offered extraordinary tactical flexibility. Polybius was so impressed by this system that he devoted several chapters of his histories to describe it in minute detail. The positioning of officers was crucial. Every century of 80 men had a centurion who stood at the extreme right of the first rank. This position was simultaneously the most honorable and the most dangerous. The centurions had a mortality rate much higher than that of ordinary soldiers. The Roman stelae show that the life expectancy of a centurion in active combat was only 7 to 10 years. They wore transverse crests on their helmets to be easily identifiable, but this also made them priority targets. The Roman cavalry, although never as famous as the legions, played a vital role in positioning. They were placed on the wings, protecting the flanks of the infantry. Julius Caesar in battle frequently used his cavalry in a creative manner. At Pharsalus, he positioned a force of light infantry mixed with cavalry on the right wing, an innovation that completely surprised Pompey and was decisive for victory. Something that films rarely show is the role of field engineers. Before the battle, specialized teams dug small disguised pits with branches in front of the Roman lines. These traps, called wilia for their resemblance to lily flowers, were particularly effective against cavalry charges. During the siege of Alesia, Caesar ordered the construction of thousands of these traps, documenting the process with details that still allow precise archaeological reconstructions today. The Roman armament was distributed strategically. Every legionary carried 2 pila, heavy throwing spears with iron tips that bent on impact, becoming useless so the enemy could not throw them back. The first line had lighter pila for greater range. The second line had heavier and more lethal pila, behind the main lines. The archers and slingers, frequently auxiliaries from conquered provinces like Syria or the Balearics, prepared their weapons. Battlefield communication depended on a sophisticated system of signals. Different standards communicated different commands. The eagle of each legion, the aquila, was the most sacred symbol, and its position indicated the center of the formation. Smaller standards, vexilla, marked each cohort. The cornu and bucina, different types of trumpets, played specific patterns for specific commands. Vegetius lists more than 30 different trumpet calls, each signifying a different order: advance, retreat, tighten the formation, open the formation, and so on. The terrain was manipulated as much as possible. Roman commanders preferred to position their troops on slight elevations. giving an advantage in the charge. They avoided marshy or too rough terrain where the ordered formation would be difficult to maintain. During the Roman conquest in Britain, the general Agricola frequently spent days looking for the ideal battlefield, forcing the Caledonians to fight on ground chosen by Rome. The auxiliaries, non-Roman troops recruited from conquered peoples, were positioned strategically. The Syrian archers stood behind the main lines. The Nubian cavalry protected the flanks. The slingers from the Balearic Islands, famous for their deadly precision, were scattered along the front. The Roman Empire used the specialties of each conquered people, creating a truly multicultural army. A crucial psychological aspect was the visibility of the gods before the battle. Military priests performed sacrifices and read omens. Sacred chickens were fed. If they ate avidly, it was a good sign. If they refused the food, it was a sign of imminent disaster. Although pragmatic commanders like Caesar occasionally manipulated these rituals, they were taken extremely seriously by ordinary soldiers. The initial moment of confrontation in Roman battles was a demonstration of controlled violence that has no equivalent in modern films. While Hollywood shows armies running against each other in chaotic charges, the reality was much more calculated and, in a certain way, more terrifying. The attack began with the velites, light soldiers armed with small round shields and light spears. They ran in front of the main lines, harassing the enemy with a rain of projectiles. Polybius describes how these young soldiers, many still adolescents, advanced in dispersed groups, threw their spears, and retreated quickly. The objective was not to cause massive losses, but to disorganize the enemy formations and provoke premature charges. When the main lines approached approximately 30 meters, occurred what the Roman soldiers called the launch of the thunder. On command, the entire first line threw their pila simultaneously, 2,000 iron projectiles, each weighing approximately 2 kilograms, flew in an arc through the air. The sound was deafening. Livy compares it to the thunder of a storm. The effect on enemy formations was devastating. The pilum was an ingeniously designed weapon. Its long iron tip penetrated shields. Then the shaft bent under its own weight. The enemy could neither remove it quickly nor throw it back. The soldiers were forced to abandon their shield or fight with a heavy piece of metal attached to them. Modern experiments show that a pilum could penetrate 5 centimeters of wood covered with leather, easily crossing most shields of the time. Immediately after the launch of the pila, the Roman legions advanced, but not in a disordered run as shown in films. They advanced with a rapid and controlled step, maintaining the formation. Every legionary placed his shield overlapping that of his companion on the right, creating a mobile wall of wood and iron. The centurions shouted, "Maintain the order constantly." The moment of the initial impact was called concursus. The sound of thousands of shields colliding was so characteristic that veterans could identify different types of enemy troops just by the sound of the impact. Celtic light wood shields made a different sound from Greek bronze shields. The first seconds after impact frequently decided the outcome of the entire battle. The gladius combat began immediately after impact. Unlike the long swords shown in films, the gladius was a thrusting weapon, not a cutting one. It measured only 60 to 70 centimeters in length. Vegetius explains that during Roman training, recruits learned that a cut rarely kills, but a thrust 2 fingers deep is fatal. The soldiers trained by striking wooden posts until the movement became instinctive. The combat technique was brutal and effective. The legionary kept the shield in front, creating protection. With his right hand, he held the gladius low near the hip when an opening appeared. Frequently, when the opponent raised his arm to strike, the Roman delivered an upward thrust aiming at the abdomen or groin of the enemy. The blade penetrated under the ribs, perforating vital organs. Death was not instantaneous. Men wounded in this way could fight for several minutes before succumbing. The smell of the battlefield was something no film can reproduce. Exposed blood, urine, and excrement. Many men lost control of their bodily functions in the terror of combat. Roman veterans spoke of the red mist, a combination of dust, blood vaporized by body heat, and sweat that made it difficult to see beyond a few meters. Julius Caesar mentions in his memoirs how in prolonged combats the ground became so slippery with blood that it was difficult to maintain balance. The rotation of troops was a crucial aspect of Roman tactics that Hollywood completely ignores. After approximately 15 to 20 minutes of intense hand-to-hand combat, a surprisingly short period, the men of the first line were exhausted. At that moment, the centurions ordered an extraordinary maneuver. The first line retreated through the spaces of the second line, and the fresh Principe's soldiers took over the combat. This rotation was practiced relentlessly during training and worked like a well-oiled machine. Battle cries were used strategically, while the Romans advanced in silence. At the moment of impact, they unleashed a deafening cry, the Barytus. This cry was not only to intimidate, it had a practical function. Modern studies of combat psychology show that vocalizing during intense physical effort temporarily increases muscle strength and reduces the perception of pain. The first losses were the most psychologically traumatizing. Seeing the man next to you fall, blood spurting from a wound, affected the soldiers deeply. This is why the Roman legions invested so much in unit cohesion. Soldiers fought alongside men they had known for years, sometimes decades. The social pressure not to abandon comrades was immense. Desertion under fire was punished by decimation. One soldier out of 10 in the unit was executed, chosen by lot. If the first moments of the battle were controlled and organized, prolonged hand-to-hand combat transformed into something much closer to the hell described by Dante than any film scene. It was the reality that separated veterans from recruits and where Roman wars showed their most brutal face. Fatigue was the greatest enemy. Modern experiments using replicas of Roman equipment show that fighting with the lorica segmentata, the shield, and the gladius for only 10 minutes causes extreme fatigue. The shield alone weighed approximately 10 kilograms. Holding it high while striking, defending, and moving required extraordinary physical strength. After half an hour of continuous combat, even well-trained soldiers had arms trembling uncontrollably. The heat was unbearable. The iron armor turned the body into an oven. In the Mediterranean summer, temperatures inside the lorica could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The soldiers literally cooked in their own armor. Dehydration killed as much as enemy swords. Caesar mentions how in battles in Hispania, soldiers died of sunstroke. Even after winning the fight, the survivors drank obsessively, often consuming contaminated water that caused devastating dysentery. Days later, Roman training focused on energy economy. While Gallic or Germanic barbarians hacked wildly with long swords, quickly consuming energy, the legionaries made short and effective movements. A well-placed gladius strike required minimal movement. Vegetius insists, better to wound the enemy than to kill him. A wounded man screamed, demoralized his companions, and occupied 2 or 3 men to carry him off the battlefield. A dead man simply fell. The psychology of killing was complex. Modern military studies show that most human beings have a deep psychological resistance to killing another human being in close combat. The Romans overcame this through systematic dehumanization during training. The enemies were called dogs, pigs. The religious practices also helped. Before the battle, the soldiers were ritually absolved of guilt by military priests. Wounds in Roman battles were horrible. Gladius wounds to the abdomen exposed the intestines. Livy graphically describes men trying to put their viscera back inside while continuing to fight. Facial wounds were particularly common. Broken jawbones, perforated eyes, cut noses. Archaeological discoveries on sites like Chalcurisa, where the legions of Varus were massacred, showed skulls with multiple slash wounds, evidence of execution after capture. The Roman armament was maintained throughout the continuous combat. Legionaries carried whetstones and oil in small pouches. During pauses in the fighting that occurred when both sides were too exhausted to continue, the soldiers quickly sharpened their blades. Gladii became blunt after repeatedly cutting through bone. A blunt blade did not penetrate armor or shields effectively. The second and third lines did not remain idle. While the hastati fought, the Principes rested, drank water, received care for light wounds. More importantly, they observed the enemy, identifying patterns, weaknesses, particularly dangerous warriors. When they took over the combat after the rotation, they already knew where to concentrate their efforts. The duration of combat varied enormously. Some battles ended in minutes when one side broke immediately. Others dragged on for hours. The Battle of Cannae lasted from noon until sunset. Approximately 6 hours of almost continuous combat. Men fought until they could literally no longer lift their arms. The breaking point was critical. When a formation began to collapse, panic spread instantly. Men turned their backs and ran. This was the most dangerous moment. Most deaths in Roman battles occurred during the pursuit of fleeing enemies. Men with their backs running were easy targets. Cavalry in particular delighted in this phase, knocking down the fugitives and killing them while they were on the ground. The cries of the wounded were constant. Men with abdominal wounds screamed for hours before dying. Some begged to be killed, asking their comrades to end their suffering. The Romans had no effective analgesics. The best that military doctors could offer was strong wine or opium imported from the East, and the latter only for high-ranking officers. While thousands of Roman soldiers engaged in mortal combat, the Roman commanders faced their own extraordinary challenges. Unlike the cinematic image of generals watching comfortably from distant hills, the reality of command during Roman battles was much more dynamic and dangerous. Julius Caesar was famous for commanding by example. During the battle against the Nervii in Gaul, when one of his legions was about to break, Caesar personally ran forward, grabbed a shield from a soldier, and began to fight. His physical presence on the front line galvanized the soldiers. Commanders who demonstrated personal courage inspired fanatical loyalty. The positioning of the commander was crucial. Most Roman generals stood on elevations behind the main lines, constantly moving on horseback, accompanied by elite cavalry who served both as bodyguards and messengers. The Roman Empire developed a system of mounted messengers that could cross the battlefield in a few minutes, carrying orders to different parts of the formation. Communication was the greatest challenge. In the chaos of combat, with thousands of men shouting and metal clashing, it was impossible to be heard. This is why the Romans depended on visual signals. The standards were raised, lowered, moved according to specific patterns. The signiferi, standard bearers, wore bear or lion skins on their armor, making them visually distinct even at great distance. Tactical decisions had to be made in a few seconds. When a commander saw a gap in the enemy formation, he had only a few moments to exploit it before the opportunity closed. Roman military strategies emphasized flexibility. Polybius lists dozens of different formations that could be ordered by trumpet signals. The psychological pressure on commanders was immense. They were responsible for the lives of thousands of men. Bad decisions resulted in massacre. Varus, whose 3 legions were destroyed in the Teutoburg forest, threw himself on his own sword. The shame of defeat was considered worse than death. Commanders used reserves strategically, keeping fresh units hidden behind the lines. When the enemy was exhausted, his troops were launched at the critical moment. At Zama, Scipio kept his best troops in reserve until Hannibal's elephants were neutralized, then launched them against the exhausted Carthaginian phalanx. Julius Caesar in battle frequently describes how reports from mounted scouts influenced his decisions. During a Lycia, he had observers watching both the besieged Gauls and the relief army that was approaching, allowing him to coordinate his forces with extraordinary precision. Coordination with allies was particularly complicated. During the Roman conquests, the Romans fought alongside auxiliary troops from allied peoples with different tactics and equipment. Skilled commanders learned to use the strengths of each people according to their specialty: Syrian archers for suppressive fire, Gallic cavalry for flanking, Germanic infantry for frontal combat. Command accidents were fatal. Messengers were killed before delivering orders. Signals were misinterpreted. During the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, there are accounts of entire units fighting against their own forces because they could not identify them in the chaos of battle. The end of active combat did not mean the end of death. The hours after a battle were as brutal as the combat itself, only in a different way that films never show. The reality of the after-battle of the ancient Roman army revealed aspects of war that history prefers to forget. The battlefield was a nightmare scene. Thousands of bodies covered the ground. Livy describes how after Cannae the ground was so covered with blood and bodies that it was difficult to walk. The smell was indescribable. Exposed blood and viscera, and the beginning of decomposition under the hot sun. The wounded presented the greatest problem. Thousands of men lay with wounds ranging from superficial cuts to horrible mutilations. The cries continued for hours. Most wounds in Roman battles were fatal without modern treatment. Abdominal wounds invariably caused fatal infections. Men could take days to die, agonizing all that time. Military doctors performed a brutal triage. They identified who could be saved and who was beyond help. Men with severe abdominal wounds were abandoned. Spending resources on them meant letting others with better chances die. The treatment was primitive but sophisticated for the time. Wounds were cleaned with vinegar or wine. Bleeding was stopped with hot cauterizers. Bars of metal heated red hot, the smell of burned flesh mixed with the other odors. Men often fainted from the pain. Amputations were common. Crushed limbs were sawn without effective anesthesia. Men were held by several soldiers while the surgeons worked. Many died of shock during the procedure. Looting began immediately. The victors stripped the dead of their armor, weapons, jewelry. The bodies were turned over. Fingers with rings were cut off. Gold teeth were pulled out. Wounded enemies were summarily executed. Soldiers marched across the field, killing the wounded enemies with dagger blows. The identification of Roman dead was important. Soldiers had identification plates removed for recording. Names were noted to notify families and calculate pensions. Roman bureaucracy functioned even in the midst of horror. Burial was a monumental task. The Romans cremated their dead on large pyres. Wood was collected. Sometimes entire forests were cut down. The bodies were piled and burned. The process took days. The smell dominated the region for weeks. Enemy dead received different treatment. Some were left to rot as a warning. Others were buried in common pits. Polybius describes how the Romans simply piled enemy bodies and covered them superficially with earth. Wild animals feasted on the remains. Disease was an inevitable consequence. Contaminated water caused dysentery. Infected wounds caused gangrene. Tetanus killed days after minor wounds. Men who survived combat frequently died of infection in the following weeks. Psychological trauma was misunderstood. Veterans developed what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder. The Romans had no concept of psychological trauma. Affected soldiers were dismissed as incapable. Some became beggars. Many committed suicide. Victory celebrations occurred while the wounded agonized. Wine was distributed. Loot was shared. This juxtaposition of celebration and suffering is disturbing from a modern point of view. But for the Romans, it was simply how things were. The reality of an ancient Roman army battle was fundamentally different from what Hollywood shows us. It was not honorable confrontations between heroic warriors. It was brutal encounters where trained men executed calculated tactics to kill efficiently, where discipline beat individual heroism, and where death continued long after the sword stopped falling. Understanding how Roman battles really worked gives us a perspective not only on the history of Rome, but on the nature of war itself. Roman soldiers were ordinary men transformed into combat machines through intensive training and iron discipline. Their legacy is not only the roads and aqueducts they built, but the lessons on organization, logistics, and military strategy that influence modern armies up to today. What aspect of the reality of Roman battles surprised you the most? Comment below and do not forget to subscribe for more content on the military history of Rome. In the next video, we are going to explore the secret weapons that the Roman legions used to win impossible battles. See you soon.